Hey everyone, this is Sandeep back with another video. And today's video is one of the requests from one of my YouTube channel viewer. He has requested for the Redux video. So in today's video, we're going to learn Redux and that too in one video. And I can guarantee you can become a you can this video will be a journey from a beginner to the pro in Redux. Okay, so the most important question we need to answer is what's Redux? And this is quite simple definition of Redux, a predictable state container for JS apps. Now you need to focus on these two keywords which I have highlighted here, right? It's predictable and JavaScript app. So most of the people, they think like Redux is made for React, but that's not true. Redux is made for JavaScript apps. So you can use Redux with React, you can use Redux with Angular, Vue, and even pure JavaScript applications. That's why it has been mentioned here, right? So basically, Redux is a state container. It's more of, a data management system. If you heard of SQL, right? We use SQL for managing our data. Similarly, we use Redux to manage our state, our UI data in our front-end applications. So it's used to organize and manage data, and that too in a predictable manner. I mean, you can predict, the state of your application at any time. And we are going to see that practically. Just try to focus and understand the definition right now. So it's a predictable state container for JavaScript applications, and Redux can be used with any framework. I mean, pure JavaScript application also. So it's a tiny JavaScript library, pretty small, I would say. So if you include in your application, be it React, Vue, JavaScript, I mean, you can forget about it. I mean, it's really small. And you can visualize your data flow. And we're going to see that practically how you can visualize your data flow using Redux. And the most important thing is the problem which Redux solves, and one of the advantages of using Redux, and practically I'm using Redux in my organization, in my projects. Initially, I thought maybe Redux is not good, but as I gain more and more experience in Redux, I understood the advantages of using Redux. So this is one of the biggest advantage I can say. So obviously we talked about organize and manage data. You can predict your state. This is one of the biggest advantage, and Redux can be used for making complex applications. If you're making a small application, I wouldn't suggest to use Redux. Okay, so advantage of using Redux, say suppose I have application, say suppose this is the component hierarchy I have. Okay, so I have the app as a main container, and I'm talking about React here, and my app has component 1, component 2, and component 3. There are 3 different components that app contains. And say suppose I have a property called name equals to John, which is defined inside the app component, right? I want to pass this name equals to John from here to here till level 3, this component, right? The only way I can do that in React is I need to pass this John first to component 3. Okay, then component 3 will pass John to level 1 component, and then level 2, and then level 3. So I have to go through this long hierarchy of components, right, to pass this small name equals to John property from one level to second level to third to fourth level. So Redux is magical, Redux solves this problem. So I can take this name equals to John, and I don't need to go through this hierarchy. I can directly pass this property to level 3 component using the magic of Redux. And that's what I'm going to show you practically. So you just need to understand, and I'm going to tell you, I mean, Redux is quite overwhelming, but it will be easy, after this video. So this is one of the advantage of using Redux. And another advantage, if you're working on any complex application, use Redux, because you will know the state of your application at any time, and that's why they call it a predictable state container. And you can visualize your data flow also. You can organize and manage data very well. So this is some of the advantages of Redux. Now let's move on. Before that, let's take a quick pause here, and then we are going to make a counter application in React, and then we are going to take the data, the small data of counter application, and we are going to manage that data using Redux, because Redux is used for organizing and managing data. So let's have a quick pause, come back, and we will jump into writing some code. Welcome back. Now let's continue our journey, and in this part of the video I'm going to create counter app using React. Now Redux, as I said, Redux can be used with other frameworks also. So if you don't want to use Redux with React, probably you can skip this part of the video, because I'm going to cover Redux in the next part of the video. But to set the context, to understand Redux very well, we need to understand, like, we need to create something. We need to something in this, some of the framework, right? Maybe React, Vue.js, or JavaScript. So going to create a counter app, and we're going to take the state from the counter app, and we're going to move it into Redux. So let's quickly get started. So you can see I have my project already created. So I have created a counter app in React, and I have opened that folder. So I'm using create React app for creating my folder structure, the project structure. You can use anything else. And as I'm going to write code in React. So if you don't know React, probably you want to learn React, you can watch my 10 days React series, and this video is part of it. I'm going to give link somewhere. I mean, somewhere it is popping, maybe on the right hand side of your screen, top right hand side of your screen. Okay, so let's continue. So I'm going to delete all of these files because I don't need it. This is a standard way of doing it. So I'm going to delete it, and I'm going to start from scratch. And I'm going to write code quickly because, this is a Redux video. So maybe I'm going to fast forward some part of this video. So I'm going to create index file. I'm going to create a components folder, and inside that folder I'm going to have different components. I'm going to have app.js, and I'm also going to create counter.js. So this counter is going to be my counter app. So my app component is ready. I'm going to import it inside my index.js, and let's import it. And I'm rendering my app inside the root element. So this is React. Now my application is already running. I'm going to switch back to my application. You see here, right? I'm going to refresh. See that? My app is here. I'm going to zoom in a bit. So you can see the app here, right? I'm going to build the counter app quickly. So let me create the counter component, which I'm going to import inside my app. So now my counter is ready. I'm going to import it inside the app. Okay, so I have my counter ready. I mean, the high level structure for the counter. I'm going to put some structure into it. Let's switch back to the application and see. I can see the counter, right? I'm going to build the entire HTML structure quickly. We call it basically JSX. So JSX for the counter component. So I'm going to start. Okay, so you see my JSX or HTML structure for the counter. And if we switch back to the application, see that? Now let's put some layout into the application. So I'm going to write some CSS. And if we go back to the application, see that? It's a line at the center. Now let's put some styling into different components like this number, this input, this increment and decrement buttons. Okay, so the HTML structure and the layout and the styling is ready. You see the application is looking good. I would say not very beautiful, but I mean, someone can use it, right? Someone can at least see, at least, I mean, this is not very basic HTML application, I would say. or a web application, I would say. Okay, let's put in some functionality into our counter. So how this is going to behave basically, so I'm going to click on increment, and this is going to increment this number from 0 based on the value I'm going to enter here. So say suppose I have entered 1 here, and if I click on increment, it should increment by 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And when I click on decrement, it should decrement by 1, like 10, 9, 8, 7. If I put 10 here, and if I click on increment, it should increment by 10, 20, 30, 40, something like that. And similar is going to happen when I'm going to click on decrement, it's going to decrement by 10. Right, so I can put any value here. So this is my step value, and these buttons are basically actions which are going to increment this value. So let's put in some functionality using React. I'm going to quickly do that. So I'm going to use state, and I'm going to create two different state variables here. One state variable will be for the steps and one for the count. So you see that I have created two different state variables here. Now I'm going to plug those state variable with my HTML structure or JSX. So here I'm going to show the count basically. So I'll show the count here, and I'm going to show the steps here, so that this will be value and the value will be steps. I'm going to save. If we come back, see the state is getting populated, right? 0 and 1. Now let's put some action into our application. So on click, so basically when I'm going to change this, right, on change. So right now, if I go back to my application and if I click here, right, you don't see the value getting incremented, or if I try to enter any value here, it's not working because I've connected my input, the number input, with the state value in React, right? And the state value, that steps value, is always going to be 1. That's why this is not changing. So somehow, I need to listen for the on change event of this input, and I need to change that value. So let's do that. And for that, I'm going to write on change. And on change, I'm going to write a function. And I'm going to get the e value. I'm going to set my steps value using my set steps function. And I'm going to set this value to e.target.value. And I need to cast it to number because this is going to return me a string value. So I'm going to change it to number. And now if I go back and if I click, see that it's working. I can enter like 20 here and it's working. Now let's put action to the increment and decrement button. So I'm going to use on click function, and this is the increment is going to basically increment the count. So I'm going to write set count, and set count is going to increment the value of my current value of count plus I'm going to use steps. Okay, so I'm going to save. If I go back and if I click now, I'm going to reset it to 1. See that? It's incrementing by 1. If I put the value of 10 here and if I click on increment, see that? Now let's put some functionality for the decrement button also. This is quite easy application, So I'm going to copy and paste basically this on click just to save time. And I just need to change this plus to minus. And now if I go back, see that? So I can set any value, don't set it to 0 because it's not going to work. So set it to any value and just click on increment or click on decrement, and that's going to work, right? I can put 2 and decrement, something like that. So I think application is ready. It's quite easy application to create counter, and I put in all the standard. If you see the class name, values, right, and the structure and everything, like how you build a big app. So I think this is a good time. Our counter app is ready. Let's take a quick pause, come back, and then we are going to plug Redux into the counter app. But before plugging in Redux into the counter app, I'm going to explain Redux separately. It will not depend on React or anything. You can learn it. You can learn Redux as a separate entity, I would say. So let's have a quick pause, come back, and we will understand the terminologies behind Redux. So what I'm going to cover, I have created really simple, step-by-step way of understanding Redux. So we're going to learn Redux step by step, and this is really going to be interesting. So let's take a quick pause, come back, and we'll continue the video. Welcome back. Now let's finally move into the Redux part, and I'm going to explain Redux step by step. And this part of the video you can follow separately. It doesn't depend on any framework. You can apply all of this concept, all of this Redux concept to React, JavaScript, or Vue. I mean, this is more of a Redux part of the video where we are going to talk about Redux. Now, I could tell you one and most important thing. Redux has some specific set number of steps that you need to follow. That's where I said Redux is overwhelming, because you need to remember all of these steps, and I have made good notes around it, if you see here, right? So all of these different steps we are going to talk about in this part of the video, and I'm going to take away Redux. I'm going to talk about Redux separately, and probably in the next part we'll talk about how to connect React and Redux together. So let's get into it. So first and the most important step that you need to take for Redux is state extraction. If I go back to what's Redux, Redux is a predictable state container for JavaScript apps, and it is used for organizing and managing data. So obviously you need to take the data, the state, out of the application. It will be part of the application, but we're going to manage the entire state of our application through Redux. So first of all, we need to extract the state. So let's do it. Let's do the state extraction in our case, in our application. So if I go back to my code, my React code, and if I look at my counter application, the answer to this question is really easy. What's the state in our counter application? And the state in our counter application is steps, which I use to increment the count. So both count and steps are the data, are the state of my application. So I'm going to extract it, and I'm going to write the entire Redux code, this step here. So for the timing, what I'm going to do, I will come back to my index.js, and I'm going to comment all of this code, and we are going to write Redux here inside this index.js only. So if I go back to my application, you won't be able to see anything here. If I refresh, we have empty slate. Okay, so step one. So state, extracting the state, steps, and count. There are two different variables here. So I can go ahead and create two different variables, but that's not a good idea. The better way of creating state is to put it into a container. So I'm going to put it into a container, and I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to create my state. So I'm going to create a new variable called initial state. Now, these are some of the naming convention I'm following from the Redux world. Initial state, and I'm going to create an object, and inside that object I'm going to have a steps. I'll probably start with 1, and the count is 0. What is the meaning of initial state? So I'm going to write some define initial state of the app. So this is the initial state of my app. So you see here, right? I took out the state from counter, the steps and count, and I've created a separate object called initial state, and I put all of my state data into that object. So this is one of the step, extraction of your state, which you need to take when you're writing a Redux code. That's where it's a really important. You need to spend a lot of time in planning. If you're thinking of using Redux in any of your project, the most important step that you need to follow is plan your state when you start your project. So that's where I'm taking this really simple example of counter so that it's easy to understand. So we are done with the first step, I would say, partially. So state is one part of it, but we need to put state into something called store. So store, because if I go back to the definition of Redux once again, you see here, right? Redux is used to organize and manage data, and to do that we have to create a store, and we can't create store without having a Redux with us. So first of all, I need to install Redux into my application. So in my counter app, I'll go back to terminal, and probably I need to open a new terminal tab, or I'll stop my application for the time being, and I'm going to install npm install, just run this command npm install Redux. So I'm installing Redux so that I can create a store, because I have extracted the state. I need to put it into store, which will manage my state. Okay, so let's install Redux, and I'm going to say save. I'm going to use save only for now. And it's going to take some time. Let it install. Okay, so we have Redux installed. I'm going to start my application once again. And there you go. Our application is running. Now let's create a store. So to create store in Redux, you just need to import a function called create store. This is the name of a function which we can import from Redux. So I have installed Redux. If you want to see whether Redux has been installed or not, you just open your package.json and you see here, right? I got the Redux version 4.1.1. So I got the Redux. I'm importing the create store function, and I'm going to use this create store function to create store to manage my state. So I'm going to name it store, and I'm going to call create store function. Now this create store function takes another function as an input, and that's a function. So I just need to pass a function to it. So probably I'll do one thing. I'll start like this. Okay, I'm going to pass an empty function to it. Not empty, but it's going to return me the initial state, I would say. So this function has a special name called a reducer. Okay, I told you a lot of new terms which are going to come, right? The store, the state already know, but the store, right? And now I'm talking about reducer. So basically, when we create a store, we pass a function to create a store in Redux, and this function is called a reducer function. Right now, I'm just returning initial state. Okay, so be with me. I'm going to talk about a reducer in a while, because in Redux you cannot change the state directly. I mean, you cannot do this. So say suppose I want to change the state, right? Suppose I want to change the state. Say suppose I want to change the count. I cannot write something like this. Go ahead and increment the count plus equals to maybe by 10, something like this. This is not recommended when you're using Redux, and there is a reason behind it: to maintain the history of the state. And I can give you the example, right? If I directly change any particular variable, I lose its previous value. So right now the count value is 0. If I increment it by 10, it's going to change it to 10 because I don't have the previous value, and that history has to be maintained. So I'll talk about it later on. But to create a store, we call a create store function, and we pass it a function which is returning the state. So this reducer function is actually a manager. You can say it's a manager to manage the state, and we will see, like, once you know all these steps, you can connect the dots, and then that will be the enlightenment where you will understand, okay, this is how Redux works. So let's move on to the next step, and the step number 2, right? I'll go back to. So I've already written a step 2, right? So we have extracted the state, we have created the store, and even we have initialized the state also. So we have already taken 3 steps, in one go. So I have created a store, I have initialized the state, right? I've created a store, and I have passed. I'm returning the initial state also from my store. So I have given the initial state. Okay, this is the initial state which I'm returning from here. And this function we are going to modify as we move on. Now, if I go back to my application, counter application when we were creating, right? So when I click on that increment button, right, there is an action. So next step is taking action. So some things happen without actions, like loading of data. Maybe I'm loading the products data. So that is one of the action, but it doesn't depend probably not on click of a button. But in case of counter application, in our application, right, what are the actions you need to understand, right? So when I click on that increment button, that's an action, and that action is something which should increment the counter value. I have that decrement button also, where when I click on that decrement button, right, it should decrement my counter. Those are action. So if you want to modify the state, as I said, you cannot directly modify the state something like this. To modify the state, you need to take actions. Actions is the only way you can modify the state. And in our case, what are the two different action we have? We have the increment action and we have the decrement action. So I'm going to create two different action variables here. This is how you do it in Redux. This is Redux way, and you need to learn it basically. So const, I'm going to create increment action, and action is nothing but an object in Redux. And that action object has two different properties. One is type, because you need to name the action so that store. So that Redux store can differentiate, or the reducer function can differentiate between those actions, and based on those differences, it can manipulate the data. Okay, so first action is increment, and with increment, I can pass some data, and we call that data as payload. We call that data as payload. Payload is nothing but, payload is used to return new data. So in our case, what is the state? Initial state, we have count as 0. And I want to increment my count with the steps value. So in our case, the payload is steps, right? So I'm going to pass initial, or maybe I'll use some hard-coded value for now. I'll pass the payload as 1. And we will see as we move on, because then you will be able to connect the dot. So whatever UI actions, whatever user interface actions which are happening in your Redux, in your application, right? Those are nothing but actions, I would say, in Redux. So we have another action called decrement action, which I'm going to write. And again, it's going to have two different properties. First one will be type, which will be decrement, and I'm going to pass a payload. And in this case, I'm going to hardcode a payload to 1. Same thing. So I've created the actions, right? Because to modify the state, you need to take the actions, and this is how we create the actions. So I did one step only. I have created the actions. Let's go back to our notes once again. So extraction of state, creating a store, state initialization. Now I have created the actions. Now we need to take actions, right? Based on when I'm going to take those actions, based on those actions, my state is going to get modified. Now, my state is not going to modify directly. For that also, I need to write a function. And that function is called a reducer function. As I said, right, you cannot directly modify the state something like this in Redux. You need to write a reducer function, and reducer function is responsible for modifying the state. So let's write our reducer here. So I'm going to call it counter reducer. I'm just naming this function as counter reducer, and I'm going to write this counter reducer function here. So let me keep actions like this, and I'm going to say reducer, and I'm going to write a function called counter reducer, which will be a function, and this function is going to accept two different input values. The first one will be the state. Okay, and I'm going to assign it initial state value. I'm going to explain why I have assigned this. And second one is action, which I have created here, right? So when this store is going to get created, this counter reducer function is going to get executed. So when the first time I'm creating a store, I need the initial state value, which I have defined here. So initial steps would be 1 and count would be 0. That's what I am doing here, because I need to return my state here. Whatever new state or whatever state I'm creating, I need to return that state. So whenever I'm going to create a store, so this reducer is nothing but, this create store is nothing but wrapper around this create reducer function. So I need to return that initial state when Redux is initialized. So that's what I'm doing here. So I'm taking the initial state value, I'm assigning it to the state property, and I'm returning that. Now I'm going to take care of my state modification, which is the next step. How to modify the state. So I'm going to take actions, and there is a way of taking actions. So I have already created, probably I'll call it actions only, because this is not about taking actions. This is about creating actions. I need to modify this step as create actions. Okay. So this is more of creating actions, right? Because this is how I'm going to take these actions. Now let's do the state modification. So now how we can modify the data in Redux? By taking actions. I'm going to take actions, and reducer function will be responsible for, I did a mistake here. Reducer function, this function is responsible for changing my state. I cannot change state something like this. So I'm going to listen for these actions here, whatever action is coming here. I'm going to check if action dot type is equals to increment, because I have two different actions on my UI, right? So I'm checking if action dot type is equals to increment. I'm going to change my state, but I cannot change my state something like this. In React also, right? State mutation, I mean directly modifying the state is not a good idea. We always create copy of the state, then we modify it and we return a new copy, so that we can always maintain the history of the state, right? So we are going to create now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new variable here called let new state is equals to, initially I'm not going to assign any value, and basically what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new copy of my state first. New state is equals to, I'm going to use object, as in this case my state is object. I'm going to use object dot assign, which sort of create a new object. So I'm creating new state object with, so I'm creating a new object using the existing state value, and I just need to change my counter, right? So how can I change my counter? I can use state dot whatever is the value of my, okay, I don't have a counter, basically I have a count. So state dot count is equals to state dot count plus the action dot payload, and that action dot payload is nothing but my steps. This value right now I'm passing 1, but later on it will be steps. So this is how you modify the state. So I need to pass a new object here, basically, because I'm combining different objects to create, and I just need to press one enter here. You see that? So what I'm doing, I'm creating a new state so that I can maintain the previous state, the history of my state. And I'm saying object dot assign, okay, create empty object, combine it with state, but change the count value. That will be state dot count plus action dot payload. And finally, I'm going to return this new state here. So I'm going to return new state. So whatever is the new state value, because I'm not changing the existing state. That's the beauty. That's the way we work. We create a state copy. I'll move ahead and create another else block for the different action, right? The decrement actions. I'm going to check if action dot type is equals to decrement. If it is decrement, I'm just going to do the same thing. Actually, I'm just going to copy and paste this code here. So new state, again, I'm creating a new object, state object, but this time I'm going to instead of addition, I'm going to do the subtraction. So I'm just subtracting the value of my payload, and I'm returning the new state here. So if you want to modify the state in Redux, you need to create this reducer function. And reducer function is basically responsible for checking the action, what action you have take, and based on that action we change the state values. This is how the entire flow I mean, the flow of Redux work. So we created action. So let me go back to my notes again. So we have extracted the state, something like this. So I would say something like this. I've created this initial state variable with the steps and count. Then we have created a store. So this is a store where I'm passing the reducer function. We have initialized the state. Now, reducer function basically initializes a state. So if you see here, right, I have passed state equals to initial state and action. So this initial state I'm returning here initially, right, when I'm not taking the actions. And we have created different actions to modify the state. So you can't directly modify the state, something like this, as I said. And have just created the increment and decrement action, the different UI actions which are going to happen, right? And I'm passing the payload to my action. Payload is nothing but data, which you need to, which we can use to modify the state. And we did the state modification using our reducer function. It's like a pure function which always returns a new state. So we are not directly modifying the state, we are returning a new state. So what is the advantage of it? If you create the copy of a state, you can maintain the history, right? So I can always say, suppose I have a history object, right? I'll create a let history object here. I'll just want to show you history, and that's an array, right? So before returning a new state, I can always push the existing state to this history object, history.push. And before returning a new state, I'm just going to push the state. So that's how initially what will happen, so say suppose my initial state, the steps is 1. The steps are 1, right? Now, when I'm going to change the state with the new payload, the value is going to change to 2, right? Because my payload is 1, right? I'm incrementing the value by 1. So before doing that, I'm pushing the state, the existing state, with the value of 1. With the value of 0. I'm not talking about steps. I'm talking about count actually. So count, the initial value is 0. Now it has incremented to 1. So that count 0, I am pushing into my history, right? And then my count is getting incremented by 1. So that way the value is 1. And once again, say suppose now I increment the counter, I take the another action. I'm just keeping that history of count as 0, 1, 5, 10, 20, whatever is the value. So this is more of a advantage of creating always new state. I'm cloning the state or not directly mutating the state in case of React-Redux in both the cases. Okay, now we have our store created. We know we have created action, we have created reducer function. Now the next thing is how we are going to modify the state, right? I mean, we have the reducer function ready, but to modify the state in Redux, we dispatch an action. So we have created action. Now I'm going to dispatch those actions, and after dispatching those actions, this actual state modification, actual data modification is going to happen. So let's do that. And to dispatch the action, we use something called store. Store I have created here. If you see here, right, I've used store, create store function to create the store. And we can use store.dispatch function, which takes action. Okay, we need to pass action to that. Like I have increment action. So I'm asking my store. Now I'm doing the actual data management in Redux, right? So I'm saying, hey store, dispatch this action, this increment action, so that my count will change. Now my count is 0. Please change it by 1. And by dispatching these actions, this reducer is going to get called. It's going to check, okay, what's the type of the action? And now in my case, I'm passing the increment action, which has type of increment and payload of 1. What it's going to do, it's going to execute this function with the current state value and the action. It's going to check, okay, action.type is increment. It's going to increment my count. I'm increment a count here, and it's going to return me a new state. So if I save this and if I go back to my application, you see initial state is not defined, 24, 33, 24, 33. Why initial state is not defined? Okay, I have a typo here. I'm going to change it. Save. If I refresh, okay, it's another error. Cannot access counter reducer before initialization. Okay, got it. So I need to move my reducer basically, or maybe I'll change it to a function. Function counter reducer. I just need to remove this and this, and it will be able to access. See that? Now I'm going to open my dev tool. This is what we are going to check inside the dev tool, our console tab. I don't see anything, right? I can see the decrement action is assigned a value but never used, but I don't see my state values. Now, to see the state value, to see the current state of your store, we use a function called, so I'm going to subscribe to my store. So I'm going to use store.subscribe. So this is a function which we use to see the state values, and it again takes function as an argument, and inside this function I'm going to console.log my current state. So I'm going to use store.getState. So this is a function, right? So I'm saying, hey store, I'm going to subscribe to you, and whenever I'm going to dispatch, any action, whenever I'm going to take any action in Redux, you just tell me what is the current state of my application. So I'm going to save it, and you see here, right, I'm dispatching the increment actions. Probably I'll comment it first, and I'll go back to my application, and I'm just going to put some string here, state, something like this. Okay, and let's not use this arrow, probably use something like this. So if I go back, I don't see any state because I haven't dispatched any action, right? So let me dispatch our first action, that is increment action. Now I'm going to save and go back, and I still don't see anything here. Let me refresh, and I see the steps, right? You see the state. The count is 1. Steps, I'm not using steps yet, but the count is 1, right? And if I go back, probably let me try to log my state initially also after defining the store after here. So I'm going to put one more log here, and probably I'll console.log as initial state. What is the initial state value? And I'm going to paste this here, store.getState. So I'm checking what's the initial state of my application, because these state changes are actually after dispatching the action. I'm going to save, and if I go back and refresh my application, you see the initial state, the value of count is 0. And when I have dispatched that increment action, my value of count is 1, right? You see the history. That's how Redux, that's how we are maintaining the history values, the different values of our state. And this really helps, to see or to understand what's the state of my application at any given time. That's the beauty of Redux. And once you understand this, that will be the enlightenment of Redux, I can tell you. Okay, now let's take one more action. We have used increment action only. So I'm going to use store.dispatch again. And this time I'm going to dispatch decrement action. I'm going to save. Now we are going to see 3 different logs here, because one will be the initial state and 2 will be one for the increment action and 1 for the decrement action. See that? Initial state count is 0. Now I have dispatched increment action. See that the count become 1, and then I have dispatched the decrement action, and because of which the count again got reset to 0. You got it? So these are some of the important steps, and I can take all of this action as many times as I want, right? Maybe I can use only increment action for so many times, right? And if I refresh my application, you see the history of state values, right? Initially the count is 0, then 1, 0, 1, 2. This is beauty of Redux, right? You know the state of your application at any time, at any action, be it load action, you're loading the data from the database or API, using API, right? Or maybe you're taking some actions on the user interface. That's the beauty of Redux. You know the state of your application at any given time. Let's have a quick recap about these steps, and please practice this. I mean, this part of the video you need to practice by yourself, then only you're going to understand it. Otherwise, I don't know. I mean, it would be really difficult to understand. Okay, so first we did state extraction. We have created a store. We have wrapped our, given our initial state. So that's the state initialization. Then we have created the actions, because to modify the state, you need to dispatch the actions. And that's why we have created actions. And actions are nothing but objects. Then we did state modification using the reducer function. Reducer is nothing but a pure function. And then we have dispatched the action to change the state. You see here, right? These are all the steps we have taken. We have created the initial state. We have created a store. We have passed the reducer function, because the reducer function is responsible for manipulating the state. You cannot manipulate your state something like this. Then inside that reducer function, we have listened for different actions, and based on those different actions, we have modified our state, right? To modify the state or to initiate that modification of state, we have to create different action object. And I have created different action here, like increment action, decrement action. And finally, we have dispatched all of those action. And we were listening for store changes using store.subscribe method. And I'm using store.getState function, which returns the state of my application. Now, all of this subscribe and different things I'm using, there are some utilities out there related to Redux, like Redux Logger, which we can use. So probably we don't need to subscribe or do something like this. There are some tools also which are related to Redux, which we can use to see see the state of our application at any time. Right now I'm using console.log, but there are tools which I'm going to talk about in the next part of the video. So go through these steps, practice these steps, and then come back. We'll talk about the tools, and then we will move on and we will plug our state with our React counter application. So let's take a quick pause. This part was long, but it's important part of this video. Let's take a quick pause, come back, and we will move on and talk about different tools. Welcome back. Now let's talk about one of the tool which we can use for logging the state of our application. So right now what I'm doing, I'm using the store.subscribe method, and whenever action using strings, increment action, decrement action, or anything, okay, be it increment action, decrement action, or anything, what's going on here basically, because of the subscribe method, I'm getting the state, I'm logging the state. So if I go back to my application and if I refresh, you see here, right, I'm logging 4 different action here, right? And I can see my state, my current state of my application at any time. Now I'm going to talk about a tool, a utility which you can use for logging the state of our application at any time. And it's going to make your life so easy. It's going to make it so easy, and you'll feel awesome, I can tell you. So let's talk about that utility, and that utility is called Redux Logger. So just go on Google, type Redux Logger, and just click on this Redux Logger. And this is an npm package, npm repository which we can use. This is a utility for logging the state of our application at any time. So we're going to install this, and then we will be able to see the state of our application, something like this, at any point of time. So I'm going to install this. I'm going to install Redux Logger. So I'm going to use this command only to install it. So I'm going to go back to my terminal. Let's come out of the application and just type npm install -- save and then Redux Logger. And it's going to take some time. Let's wait until it's installed. And there you go. Now again, I'm going to start my application or restart my application. And our application is running right now. I'm not seeing any magic. I mean, to use Redux Logger, we need to do some configuration, and that configuration is already given here in the help section of this npm repository. So it's a combination of Redux and Logger, and that's why the name is Redux Logger. So we're going to use something called apply middleware. I'm going to import a function called apply middleware from Redux. Now I'm going to talk about middlewares in the later part of this video, but think like this apply middleware function, it gives you the capability of using the tools which has been created around Redux. And all those tools are actually going to make your life easier. Okay, so I'm going to use apply middleware, and we pass this function apply middleware to the store. When we create a store, right, we write this apply middleware function and we pass the utility. Now Redux Logger is a utility which I am passing as an argument to this apply middleware. So anytime whenever I'm going to dispatch any action, I don't need to listen for the subscribe method. This middleware is going to come into the picture, and it's going to play a role of logging my state at any point of time. So let's see this in action. And I'm going to go back to my application once again. And this time I'm going to first import apply middleware function. Okay. And I'm also going to import the logger from Redux Logger. So I'm importing both of them. Okay. So I got logger and I got apply middleware. I got logger from the Redux Logger. Now, when we create a store, we can pass that. I can use apply middleware function here, and I can pass logger as second argument. I just need to put comma here. So apply middleware and logger, these are some simple steps you need to take to make your life easier. Okay, now we are ready, right? Because I have connected Redux with this logger utility, so I don't need basically I don't need this console.log. Even I don't need to use this subscribe method. So I'm just going to comment this part also. Okay, so I don't need subscribe also. Now, if I go back and see in my application, I'm going to refresh it once again. See that? How beautiful it is. I mean, see, I took 4 actions here, right? Increment, decrement, increment, increment. And all of those actions are in much readable form. They're so beautiful, right? I know the action name. The first action which I took is increment action, and you see that I can see the previous state. What's the previous state of my application? So initially we started with step 1 and count 0. So if I go back here on the top, right, what was my initial state? My initial state was steps as 1 and count as 0, right? Now if I come back here, right, so this is the previous state. I took an action of increment and the payload was 1. Because of that, my next state, because of that, the state of my application is changing and steps will remain 1, but count has changed to 1 because I'm adding that payload, right? Then I took action called decrement. If I go back here, right, dispatch decrement, it's showing, right, what was the previous state? And that was this state, right? Step 1, count 1. I took a decrement action with a payload of 1, so my state has changed to 0. Then I took another increment action, my previous state, it's showing the action, the step, count 1. Again, one more increment action and count has become 2. At any, just look at the beauty of this, anytime you can see the state of your application. Whatever you are seeing on your user interface, that's available here as a log, right? As a state history. So plan like Amazon and whatever I'm seeing here, right? All of these products or all of this advertisement, think of them as a state of your application, right? So all of this advertisement, probably all of this advertisement was stored in the database, and I'm getting that data from the API, and I can plan around it by creating a state variable like advertisement. while I'm creating the Amazon product, right? I can call them as advertisement, and anytime I'm getting a new advertisement pushed into my UI, right, my state is going to change, and I can see, okay, previously I was showing the sofa advertisement, now maybe I'm showing some tools advertisement, something like that. So I can always say the things are changing based on the data, right? We can talk about products also, right? Maybe if I click around this, maybe I click on the sofa image, whatever I'm seeing here, right, these are all the products which are coming from the database. So this is again state of my application, and every time I can log that state using using Redux, and I can see the state at any time, any point of time, using the Redux logger. So this is a really beautiful utility that you can use along with Redux to see the state of your application at any time. So I think this is about Redux logger. You can also use the function called subscribe, but in case of subscribe, you need to write your own way of logging the state. But if you use Redux logger, I think your life will become easier. It's a utility. And I just want to add one more thing. You can create your own logger also. So you can import create logger function from Redux logger, and you can configure the logger with some options. Like there are so many options given here, like this is one of the option, right? Collapse, which you can use. So if I go back to my application, you see here, right, these actions are collapsed, or maybe you want to show them something like this whenever you're going to log your actions. So in that case, let's try to use this. So I'm going to use, instead of logger, I'm going to import the create logger functions. I'll go back to my application once again. I'll show you one example here. So instead of logger, I'm going to import create logger, and I'm going to create my own logger. So if I go back here, this is how we can create a logger. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it here. So I'm creating a logger with options. And what are the options I have? I have one of the options is called collapsed, right? I'm going to copy this and I'm going to pass that object collapsed. Maybe let's go with false value and let's save. And if I refresh once again, I think it's not collapsed. Let me try true value. And now if I refresh, see that? Now it's not showing all of my state values in a collapsed way. So if I want to see the details of my state at any time, I need to click on this arrow. See the beauty of Redux logger? I mean, I really like it. I mean, the things which make your life easy, I really like all those things. And Redux logger is a great utility which is going to make your life so easier. So I think this is a good time to take a quick pause, and we'll come back and let's talk about, now we know the Redux, right? We know how to use Redux. We know how to we know the different things in Redux, right? We understood some of the terms. I talked about action, I talked about reducer, I talked about dispatcher, state, right? Now let's move on, and in the next part of the video I'm going to talk about provider and connect, because now we know Redux, right? We have written code around Redux, but we need to see how we can connect Redux with React, right? And that's coming up in the next part of the video. So let's have a quick pause, take a quick break, think about Redux logger, come back, and we will connect React and Redux together. Welcome back. Now let's talk about how we can connect Redux with React. I mean, connection of React with Redux or Redux with React. But before doing that, and before we move on and talk about this connectivity between state, so now we have extracted the state into Redux. Now we need to get that state and put it into the React application, right? But before that, I need to refactor my code, because all of my Redux code, I have written this inside index.js file. So let's do a quick refactoring of our code. So I'm going to move the entire Redux code into their separate files, and this will give you an idea like how we organize our Redux code. And as this is a small application, you can apply all of these principles to big applications also. So let's do that. So first of all, I'm going to take this store, but taking the store out of the index.js file, I need counter reducer, and I need all of these imports also, right? And I need logger also. So first of all, I'm going to move the reducers, and reducers are going to need actions probably, right? So let's start this way. So I'm going to take this reducer away from here. So I'm going to control X. I'm going to create a new file inside my source called reducers. And I'm going to put my reducer, counter reducer inside that file. And let's see what are the different dependencies I have here. I don't see anything. And I'm going to export it default. Export default counter reducer. So it's basically I'm taking the function and putting it into a separate file. So I may have more reducers, right? So your application can have different modules, and for each module probably you can have one reducer, or it depends, like you can make a decision around it. So right now our application is small. It's a really tiny application, counter application, and we have one reducer only, but I have created a separate file for the reducer, and I have moved that reducer into that file. Next, I'll go back to index.js. I'm going to move and let me see what import I have in my reducers. I don't think so I have anything to import here. Okay, come back. Now I'm going to move the actions. So I'm going to take all of these actions from here, and I'm going to create a new file called actions.js, and I'm going to move the increment and decrement action inside that file, and I'm going to export these two actions, increment action and decrement action. So as I have two different action, I'm using this curly bracket. This is ES6. Now let's come back, and I don't need all of this dispatch now, because I don't need store.subscribe. So let's keep deleting the code which is not needed. Next, I need to move this creation of the store, and store, I think store doesn't need initial state, but something, I think reduces need the initial state property. Okay, so I need to keep initial state here. So I'm going to move my initial state here, save. Now I'm going to move the store part out of my index.js file. So I'm going to control X, and I'm going to create a new file called store.js, and I'm going to paste my store here. But store need counter reducer and apply middleware and logger. So I need to move this logger code from here to here. So let me do that. I'm going to paste logger here. And we need to import some of the functions here. Like I need this logger. I'm going to import, or let me cut and paste the imports also from here. So we need this create store function and apply middleware, and even this logger also. So I'm going to just cut from here, and I'm going to paste it inside my store. So we need counter reducer, apply middleware is already there, create store is already there, logger is already there, but I need to import my reducer here. So import counter reducer from /reducers. So I have my reducer also, I have my store ready. Now I'm going to remove the comments for my React application, and I'm going to remove this comment also. And now if I save, and let's see if I go back to my application, is it working? Yes, it's working. No issues. I mean, there is a possibility, after the refactor, you might miss something, but I think we are good. Our application is working fine. I can increment, I can decrement, even I can increase the steps, and then I try increment and decrement, and it is working fine. So I think we're good with the refactor part. Now, the next part of this video is about how we can connect React and Redux together. So I think let's have a quick pause, and then we will talk about how we can connect React with Redux, and I'm going to provide the information once again step by step, React Redux step by step. And these are the steps, some of the important steps which we are going to take to connect React with Redux. So let's have a quick pause, come back, and we'll talk about it. Welcome back. Now, finally, we are going to talk about how to connect React with Redux. And to connect React with Redux, we need to install one of the npm package. So all of that code, all of that, those expertise of connecting React with Redux has already been written by someone else, some of the open source community, and we're going to leverage their knowledge with some. So the skeleton part is already ready. We are going to put the skin on it, right? And we need to write some code to make it possible. So we have our store separated, right? We have our store ready. And to connect React and Redux together, we need to install one of the npm package. So I'm going to go back to my terminal and come out of my application, and I'm going to install npm install -- save. And I want to install a React Redux. The name is really simple, connecting React with Redux. So let's enter and wait for this package to get installed. It should be quick. And there you go. We have the package installed. Now let's start the application once again. And our application is running. I mean, nothing is going to happen right now because I haven't connected React with Redux. Let's get back to the notes which I have created for you. These are some of the simple steps. And again, we are going to talk about some of the terminology which might be new for you. So React, Redux, step by step, how we can connect them together. So one of the most important thing, now we have our store, we have our state out of the React app. So right now, if I go back to my code, right? If I go back to my counter, probably let me open the counter file. I'm managing the state inside my counter component. Now I'm going to take out the state. So we have already taken out the state from the counter, right? And we have moved that into Redux. That's where our store is coming, right? Our store is now managing the state. So the first step will be how I can connect my Redux store with the React app. And to do that, we use something called a provider component. Now, provider is a component, it's a React component which we use to connect our Redux store and React app together. So that's the first thing we are going to do. So now then the step 2, once the provider is connected with the React app, how we can pass the state to our React components, right? So to do that, to pass the state to the React component, we use something called connect. And connect is not a component, it's a function which we are going to use to connect our state with a React component. And finally, this connect is going to have two different functions. One function will be responsible for passing the state from the store, right, to our component, and one function will be responsible for listening or handling the actions which we are going to take on the UI, right, dispatching those actions, right? So when I'm going to click on that increment button, right, it's going to create action. It's an action which I'm taking on the user interface. So all of these actions will be taken care by increment, decrement, right? All of these actions will be taken care by this function. So let's see step by step how we can do it. So first of all, I'm going to use provider to connect my React app and Redux store together. So to do that, I need to go back, I need to import my provider component. I think provider is a part of provider. So provider from React Redux. So this is a readily available or ready-made component, provider component, which has been created by the team of React Redux. And we just need to wrap, and I'm importing a provider at wrong place, and you just need to cut it, and I'll go back to my application basically here. And here I'm going to import my, not here, basically I need to go to index.js, and here I'm going to import that. So now I'm going to wrap my application. Now, as it is a component, I'm going to wrap my app inside this provider component. So I'm going to write provider, and I'm going to take my app from here and put it inside a provider component. Now, what this is going to do basically, the app is getting wrapped inside a provider, and I'm going to use provider component to pass my store. But I need a store, right? I need to import my store here first. So I'm going to import store from /store. And I'm going to pass. So this provider component has a property called store, which I'm going to pass here. So this store is my Redux store, the store which I have created, right? So if you go back, right, if you click on the store, I think there is something wrong with my store. Hold on. I'll go back and I'll see I've created a store, but I didn't export it. So I need to export store, export default store. And now if I come back to index.js, if I click, this is my store, right? Which has a counter reducer and which has this logger middleware also. So this provider component helps us, to bridge or to connect a Redux store with the React app. So whenever you want to connect so like we have created we have written all of the Redux code in the separate file, right? And now we need to connect that Redux store state to our React app. And to do that, these are the steps you need to follow. You just need to wrap your app, the main entry point of your application, with the provider component. And provider component has a property called store, which you just need to pass your own store. So this is step one. Let's go back and talk about how now we can connect the state. Now my my custom store, my counter store has the state. Now how I'm going to pass that state to my component, and we can pass state to any component, any React component using Redux. And to do that, we we use connect function. That's where we are going to talk about props drilling in the future. But right now, somehow I need to pass my state to my React component, and in our case, we need to pass that state not to app but to the counter. So 2 level down, right? So if you look at the hierarchy of my application, right? I have an app. Inside that app, I have a counter, and I need to pass my state inside a counter. So it's 2 level down. If my state would have been in index.js file, if suppose I have my state here, right? If I want to pass that to something, right? Maybe I'll create an empty object here, something like this: state is equals to state. Then again, I need to go inside and I need to pass that state is equals to state, something like this, or props.state, because that's going to come inside the props here, right? You're getting my point? So I'm repeating, right? I'm writing this code twice to pass the state. But because of Redux, this props drilling, right? Redux is going to help me pass my state. So if I go back to my index.js, I need to remove this code. I don't need to pass all of these props, to the hierarchy. I can directly go in the counter.js file, and I can connect this counter component with my Redux store state. And to do that, we use a connect function. So I'm going to import. I need to go into app and save it first. So I'm going to go into counter, and here I'm going to import I need to import the connect function from React Redux, as I was talking about, right? If I go back to my notes, I'm using connect function to connect my state with the React component. So in our case, our state is our maintained by counter reducer, right, inside my store, and my React component is counter. So I'm going to wrap counter using this connect function. So the first step is you need to write connect, and this connect is nothing but a function which calls another function. Now this is something new, difficult to understand, I would say. But maybe if I can give you a simple example, maybe I'll go back to my terminal and go back to my browser, and I'm going to write some code here, probably in the, let me open a snippets panel probably, and I'll show you something. Where is the snippets panel? I need to go to sources, and I'll write a new snippet here. Okay, so let's see. Like, this is like, I have a function, existing function called connect. Okay, and this is returning a function, another function, something like this. So basically what I'm doing, I'm calling this connect, which returns another function which I'm calling. So say suppose this is returning some value, maybe 10. And if I run this code, see that? So this is that syntax which I'm trying to achieve here. So I'll go back to my console and let's go back to our application now. So that's what I'm doing, connect. And connect, I'm going to connect my component, my counter component here. Counter. I'm going to change the name of my counter to counter component for the time being. Okay, because I need to use counter component here. So I'm wrapping counter component and calling connect. And this connect function actually takes two different arguments. One is called map state to props, and another one is map dispatch to props. So these are basically functions, and these functions have different responsibilities. You need to learn it actually. These steps are really important and you need to learn it. That you need to wrap your counter component, a component which is going to accept the state, which is going to accept the props. Okay. And these two functions are responsible for two different activities. So connect, which has two responsibilities, I would say, map state to prop and map dispatch to prop. So map state to props is used for passing the state. So in our case, our Redux store has the state, and how can I pass that state to my component, my counter component? To pass the state, we use something called map state to props. And I'm going to take some actions on the UI. So I need a way to dispatch those actions, right? Like how we did in Redux, right? We use store.dispatch function to dispatch the actions. How can I dispatch that? To dispatch all of those actions, we use map dispatch to props function. Okay, so that's what I did here. And this connect function is actually going to return us a new component, a new wrapped version of this counter component, which I'm going to store as a counter. And that's what I'm exporting here. So I'm not actually just exporting a counter, but I'm exporting a Redux version of counter here, right? So I've wrapped my counter component, which is my presentation component. It is responsible for the presentation of my UI with Redux using connect. And connect has two different functions, two different responsibilities. One to pass the state, and second one to listen for the actions which I'm going to take on my user interface. So now we have our counter component ready and I'm exporting it here. Now if I save this, okay, and I'm just going to log the props here. So let me log, I'm passing the props there. If you see here, right, I'm passing the props. So I'm going to console.log my props here, and let's see what we get inside our props. So if I go back to my application, if it is running, it's not running, map state to props is not defined. So let's write down those functions first. So I'm going to write const map state to props, which is a function, and it should return something. So I'm going to return the empty object for now. And I have another function called map dispatch to props. And this function is also going to return an empty object for now. If I go back and if I refresh, see that our props are empty because I'm not passing anything, right? Because I haven't plugged in any of the state passing state mechanism, or I am not listening for any dispatch event, right? Because my maps to state to prop is passing an empty object. My map dispatch to props is not listening for anything here, right? Now, if I talk about, if we go into the details of map state to props receives an argument called state, and this is nothing but our state, our initial state. So I'm going to log that here. So I'm just going to write state. And if I save it, and if I go back to my application, see that? This is the initial state of my application. And that has been maintained inside my reducer, right? My reducer is responsible for creating this initial state with the steps and with the count, right? And that's what I can see here. So now I can use my map state to props function. So I'll go back to my counter. I can use this function to pass the state, whatever state I have, and I'm going to do that. And that will come as a props to my counter component. So right now you don't see anything in the props. Let me make it more meaningful by writing something like this, string concatenation, and I'm going to destructure my state object and I'm going to pass it as a state, as a prop. So now if I go back and refresh my application, see that? Now I'm getting my initial state. I'm getting steps, I'm getting count and as 0, right? Now the state which I was maintaining inside my counter component for this steps and count, now it is coming from Redux as props. So from the state perspective, I don't need steps because steps is something which I'm going to manage inside my component, but I definitely need count because count is actually an important, I would say, state, the real state of my application. So I'm going to remove this count code because that's coming from the Redux. So if I go back, right, this count is coming from the Redux, and I'm going to replace that. This count, I'm going to replace with props.count. And now if I go back and if I refresh, I think I'm getting some error because that function is not there. So I'm going to keep this part, at least steps I need, but I have removed the set count function. So I'm going to replace it with empty function for now. Okay. Now if I go back, see that? This 0. This 0 is coming from my initial state. I'll show you. So now I'm going to go back to my reducer and I'm going to change my initial state count value to 10. And if I come back and if I refresh, see that? It's coming from Redux as a prop. Now the state management is done by Redux and that is getting passed as props to my React application. And next we need to see, like now we have this number coming. I'm going to reset it back to the 0 value. So I'm going to go back to my, I need to go back to my reducer and I need to change it to 0. And if I go back and refresh, I'm getting that value. Now we need a way, right, to increment this value, right? If I click on increment and decrement button, now nothing is happening because I have removed all of those actions from the counter.js file because I don't have any click action, right? Now somehow I need to, and this is the important part because the state management, now when I click on increment or decrement button, that state is maintained by Redux. So Redux should be responsible for changing those values. And right now, I have not written anything inside my click event. So I need to give that responsibility to Redux. And how Redux actually change the state? Redux changes the state using something called dispatch. And that dispatch function is actually passed as an argument here inside my map dispatch to profs function. And we can log that console.log dispatch. I'm just going to log it and I'll show you. And I'm going to refresh. See that? It's a function. And we can use this dispatch function to dispatch the actions. But how I'm going to dispatch those actions? Because I need to create those actions inside here. I'm going to create those actions. So the first action that we have is an increment action, which is a function which I'm going to create here. And this increment action will be responsible for changing the state, changing the count value. And to change that count value, we are going to use dispatch. And what we are going to dispatch? We are going to dispatch the increment action. So I'm going to import my increment action here. Import increment action from dot slash. I need to use dot slash actions. And I also need decrement action also. So I'm going to import both of them. Decrement action. Now I'm going to dispatch increment action here. And I also need another function called decrement to decrement the value. I'm going to write another function which is going to dispatch decrement action. I'm going to save. Now, if I go back and if I look at the props, now I was passing the state, but now we're going to see something new is happening in the props area. I'll go back, I'll refresh. If you look at the props, now you're getting count, you're getting steps, but you're getting these two functions also as a props, right? So you're getting the state values, you're getting the actions which you need to take, all right? So I can use those actions and state now. So this is a good time to, destructure our props. So I'm going to destructure my props. So I have steps, I have count, I have increment, and I have decrement. These are 4 different things I'm getting in from my props. I have changed it. Now I can remove this props from here. And now when I click on my increment button, I'm going to call the increment function, which I'm getting as a props, here. And when I click on decrement, I'm going to call that decrement function, which I'm getting as a prop. Because of this, what's going to happen basically, when I'm going to click on this increment button, it's going to call this increment function, which is going to dispatch the increment action. And you know that when we dispatch any action, when I'm going to dispatch this increment action, it's going to call my reducer function. And it's going to check whether the type is increment or decrement. And based on that, it's going to return me a new state of my application, right? That's how we are connecting, right? Things here. So if I go back to my counter again, I'm going to save and let's see this in action. So I'm going to, okay. So I need to remove, because I'm using steps, but I have steps. So I don't need to destructure steps because as I said, I don't want to use steps as my state. So I'm going to remove that. I'm going to save. And now if I refresh, my initial state is 0. I'm going to increment. See that? And now I'm getting my state value as a prop. See that? React and Redux are connected now. But the thing is, I'm not able to, if I change this value to 5 and increment, it's getting incremented by 1 only. It's not getting incremented by 5. And the reason behind it, because my steps value. So when I'm incrementing, right, if I go into my increment action, you see here, my payload is 1. And when I go back to my reducer, as my payload is 1, I'm incrementing by 1 only. Now we need a way to pass this payload to our actions. But as the action is an object, I cannot pass any value to it. That's where another terminology which is you need to understand. That terminology is nothing but action creator. Now I'm going to talk about action creator, which we didn't talk about previously. So I'm going to wrap my actions inside something called action creator, and action creator is nothing but a function, a pure JavaScript function. So I'm going to create two functions here. First one will be increment, which will be a function which is going to receive data as a property. That will be our payload, right? That steps, and it's going to return this object. I'm going to cut this from here. I'm going to put it here, or maybe I'll copy and paste and I'll remove it later. So this. So instead of using the object, the action object, I'm going to call this function now, which is going to return me an action. And what advantage it's giving me, because I can pass data to it. And now I can use that data as a payload, right? So I'm passing type as increment and payload as data, and I'm returning an object from this function. Now next, I'm going to create another action called, and I'm doing some mistake in spelling mistakes. So I'm going to copy. I'm going to create another action. Let me create from scratch the decrement action. So it is also going to accept data as an argument, and I'm going to return this decrement action object, and payload will be replaced with data. Now I don't need this increment action and decrement action, because I'm going to pass these functions, increment and decrement. Now instead of calling the action, I'm going to call these functions increment and decrement, and I'm going to go back to my counter and I'm going to import my action creators, not the actions, the increment and decrement. And instead of dispatching the actions, I'm going to call those functions, and these functions are going to accept some argument, that data is nothing but my steps. So I'm going to pass the steps value. That's the state, the React state of my counter component, that I'm going to pass here, and I'm going to pass to my decrement button also, where decrement function is getting called. I'm passing the steps, and those steps I'm going to receive as an argument to these functions. And here I'm going to replace this action with that function, that decrement function, and I'm going to pass data. So when I'm going to click, let's see the flow. When I'm going to click on increment button, it's going to call this function increment, and it is going to pass the steps, the current value of steps. It will come back, it will come here, it will call this function, and the data will be the steps. I'm going to dispatch an action. I'm going to dispatch an action only. I'm not dispatching the action creator. I'm dispatching the action. This function is returning me an action, that is increment action, and the payload is data. Those steps which I'm passing here, right? So now let's see this in action. So I'm going to go back, refresh, and now if so something is wrong. My counter component received nan. If this is expected, cast the value to a string. Okay, I did something wrong. So I'm passing these steps, and I'm setting these steps as a number value only on change. And I have this value as 1 also. Steps is what I have here. Let me see if my steps are working fine. Yes, it is working fine, but somehow increment is not working, and decrement is also not working, because this index.js, let me see. So I'm going to debug my application now. So I'm going to see what, okay, I'm not passing data here. Right, and that was a typo. That was a mistake I did. I mean, I need to pass some data. Now let's see if I increment now, it's getting increment by 1 and decrement by 1 because my payload, my steps are 1. I'm going to increase it to 2 now. And now see that? It's getting decremented by 2, now 18, 28. See that? The entire application now, the entire state management has been handled using Redux, and I have connected that React. I have connected React and Redux together using the npm package called React-Redux. I think once again, I'm saying it's overwhelming, understanding all of these terms, this action creator, and even this React and Redux connectivity using provider connect, and connect has these two functions. But I suggest, go through this part of the video again and again, try to write code by yourself. That's how, you're going to achieve, or you're going to learn the connectivity between React and Redux. Now, the next question that might be coming into your mind, right, for this such small application like counter, is it a good idea to use Redux? So yes, Redux is not made for such kind of tiny application like this counter, but I wanted to explain all of the terms in a simpler way. That's why I have used this counter. Redux is made for complex, big applications, I would say. And this is a good time. We take a quick pause, you take a break and think about all of these new terms, how we can connect React and Redux together. And in the next part of the video, I'm going to cover a medium size, not medium, another application called currency converter, which we are going to create using Redux. So that will give you more practice. So that's why, I have included a small project and a small plus project, I would say, in this video, so that the concept of Redux will be can be adopted, in an easier manner. So let's have a quick pause, come back, and we will move on and we'll create another application called currency converter using React and Redux together.